They say the Tau Empire is a beacon of unity, where every citizen serves the greater good with devotion and purpose. A civilization without internal strife, where war is waged not for conquest, but for enlightenment. But that's a lie wrapped in synthetic serenity. Beneath the gleaming armor of the fire warriors and the sterile calm of the Ethereals simmers a truth too terrible for the Empire to ever acknowledge. Unity, true unity, cannot be forced, not forever. And when that illusion shatters, it does so in fire, in blood, and in flesh. There was a cadre, no, a brotherhood, who saw through the veil. Fire Caste warriors forged in endless battle, broken by the demands of the greater good, and pushed beyond the brink by the cold manipulations of their ethereal overseers. What they did cannot be found in any Tau archive. No official communique mentions their name. But the whispers remain, of a group who turned on their masters not only in violence, but in hunger, who tore down the sacred veil and, in a moment of primal fury, devoured the very symbols of their bondage. This is their story. The Ash Kai, the fire unbound. The fire caste are forged in heat, literal and metaphorical. From the moment of their selection as youths, they are stripped of softness and sculpted into instruments of pure warfare. Their bodies are honed, their instincts sharpened, their emotions cauterized. They are not raised. They are manufactured in soul furnaces, where compassion is slag and obedience is steel. The Tau call this devotion to duty, but what it truly is bondage by fire. In the training domes of Viorlos and Sachea, the young are drilled without pause, screamed at by hardened instructors who themselves were once broken and remade. They march with discipline, they fire with precision, and they die with silence. But there is something deeper in them, something the Ethereals fear, even as they pretend to guide it. Fire, pure fire. Not just loyalty or martial pride, but an inner blaze that wants more than purpose. It wants freedom, and that fire is dangerous, because the fire caste are the only ones who are armed. They're the only caste trained in the art of death, taught to read the battlefield like scripture. They are supposed to fight for the greater good, but many never understand what it truly is. They only know that when the Ethereals say jump, they leap into hell, again and again. Decades of attrition in wars that make no sense. Watching comrades fall to bolters, blades, and biomonstrosities, and never being allowed to question why. Some do begin to question, quietly at first, amongst the younger warriors who have not yet been fully crushed by the weight of service. Around the campfires of forward operations, they whisper, "Why are we dying on worlds we've never heard of? Why do we sacrifice everything, while the Ethereals remain untouched, unbloodied? And most dangerously, what happens if we stop?" These thoughts are treason, but they are also seeds. And in certain battle-hardened cadres, especially those left too long on the front without guidance, those seeds can take root. A glimmer of rebellion stirs not from hatred, but from exhaustion. From the unbearable tension of being seen as both tool and hero, expendable and honored, all in the same breath. It's cognitive dissonance weaponized. The fire caste live short lives, not just because of war, but because of purpose burnout. When a warrior loses belief in the greater good, he becomes something else, something dangerous. The Ethereals monitor for this, of course. They rotate units, drown doubts in ceremonies and rituals, reapply the soothing balm of chemical and pheromonal correction. But every now and then, it's not enough. Because even the most obedient flame can leap the hearth, and when it does, it doesn't just burn, it consumes. To the outside eye, the Ethereals are serene, regal, wise. They wear the robes of philosopher kings and speak in honeyed tones of destiny, balance, and harmony. But this gentle mask hides something colder, something calculated. The Ethereals are not leaders, they are masters. And the glue that binds the Tau Empire is not belief, but control. From the moment a Tau is born, they are assigned to a caste. This is not a choice, It is an iron sentence. The Ethereals decide who becomes a laborer, a diplomat, a warrior, a pilot, or one of their own. And once chosen, there is no escape. Every part of a Tao's life, from their diet to their interactions, even their thoughts, are subtly curated by the doctrines passed down by these shadowy architects. The caste system is sacred, and questioning it is not just rebellion, it is spiritual heresy. At the heart of ethereal power is something still not understood even by their own people, the ability to pacify. Pheromones, it's whispered, natural chemicals exuded by the Ethereals that soothe discontent, suppress aggression, and inspire fanatical loyalty. There is no confirmed scientific analysis of these abilities because no Ethereal would ever allow such testing. But the effect is undeniable. In the presence of an Ethereal, even the most blood-raged fire warrior falls calm. Doubts dissolve. Orders are followed without question. The effect is eerie, almost supernatural. This is not leadership. It is leashing. The rituals that surround Ethereals reinforce their divine status. They do not walk among the common Tao casually. They arrive surrounded by ceremony, attended by silent aides, and cloaked in symbols of mythic authority. Their words are scripture, their judgments absolute, and yet they do not fight, they do not bleed, they do not die for the greater good. They send others to do that, and those others, especially the fire caste, are the ones who begin to feel the weight of the hypocrisy, to be sent into war after war, to watch comrades die, to know you're nothing more than a line in a tactical briefing, and then to be commanded by a creature that cannot comprehend the cost. It corrodes, slowly, painfully. Some warriors begin to sense that the Ethereals are not divine guides, but parasitic overseers, that the greater good is not a shared destiny, but a gilded leash choking every caste except one. Worse, there are whispers among the veteran cadres, that the Ethereals were not always in power, that their rise came suddenly and suspiciously generations ago, that the castes were once equal, cooperative, not stratified, and that something terrible happened to make the Tao fall in line so completely. But such thoughts are forbidden, dangerous. To even utter them invites re-education or disappearance. Yet every fire warrior who's felt the calm enforced by an Ethereal's presence knows in his gut that something is wrong, that this is not trust, it is chemical domination, it is a soft tyranny cloaked in peace. The most dangerous enemy is the one who convinces you they are your savior. The Ethereals do not need to oppress with guns or chains. They do it with belief, and when belief falters, they do it with scent. Invisible, inescapable, insidious. Dalith was never like the other Tau Seps. It was too open, too curious, too stained with human influence. The Tau who lived there were used to negotiation, to trade, to proximity with alien cultures. And that meant they were exposed, not just to new technologies and goods, but to ideas. Dangerous ideas. Things like self-determination, freedom, individuality, even heresy. It was on Dalith that the rot began, or the awakening, depending on who tells the story. In a remote outpost near the Guevesa trading zones, a fire caste cadre was stationed for rearguard defense. They were veterans of the Damocles Gulf campaigns, a hardened and thinned group of survivors led by a scarred commander known for pragmatism rather than zeal. Their role was dull: patrol, report, stand watch. But that boredom bred something lethal: reflection. They mingled with human auxiliaries. They overheard rumors. They read fragments of imperial scripture, rebel pamphlets, and even listened to smuggled Vox transmissions. At first, it was amusement. Crude, bloated humans talking about gods and kings. But slowly, unnervingly, parts of it began to resonate. Not the theology, but the passion, the sense of autonomy, the defiance, and most importantly, the rage against an elite that saw itself as divine and untouchable. The fire warriors began to look at their ethereal in a different light. A minor figure in the hierarchy, the Ethereal assigned to the outpost was young and overly fond of ceremonial speeches. He preached the greater good with the same hollow cadence every dusk, oblivious to the eyes growing colder around him. He had no real authority over these seasoned killers, just the stench of entitlement and the phenomenal fog that once subdued them. But Daleth's air was strange. Whether it was the human proximity, the alien flora, or sheer psychological exhaustion, the usual pacifying effect began to fade. And when the pacification faded, the thoughts grew teeth. The final push came during a raid by renegade Kroot. The outpost was nearly overrun. Half the fire caste were wounded or dead. The Gwevesa auxiliaries fought like cornered animals. And the Ethereal? He locked himself in a comms room and demanded extraction. No orders, no coordination, just panic and cowardice. When the dust settled and the dead were counted, something in the commander, Shaso Korvash, fractured. He stood before his cadre, bloodied, breathing hard, and said words no Tau was meant to say. He is unworthy. There was no trial, no inquiry, no broadcast to higher command. The Ethereal was summoned to the courtyard under pretense of a debrief. What happened next was whispered in shadows, spoken in broken low Gothic by human witnesses who fled the scene in terror. A gunshot, a scream, then silence. No clean, clinical execution, no mercy, just primal release. And once it had begun, there was no going back. The cadre didn't turn themselves in. They didn't self-immolate in ritual penance. They buried the Ethereal's remains beneath the Kroot corpses, burned the comm logs, and stayed silent. But their silence was not shame. It was clarity. For the first time, they felt unchained. The command structures they once obeyed had revealed their hollow center, and in its place, something new was born. Anger, purpose, identity without servitude. Daleth had lit the fuse, and the fire would spread. Shaso Viorlos Korvash was a name once spoken with pride among the fire caste. A veteran of a dozen campaigns, he had survived the worst of the Damocles conflicts, the Tyranid incursions, and even skirmishes against orc warbands so large they blotted out the stars. His command style was brutal, efficient, and deeply loyal, until the cracks began to show. Korvash had always been a practical leader. Where others relied on rigid formations and tactical purity, he adapted. He learned. He listened to the Gwevesa not with disdain but curiosity. He recognized the value of experience beyond doctrine. That made him popular among his cadre, but suspect in the eyes of the Ethereal hierarchy. He received fewer honors than his record warranted. He was rotated more frequently, likely in attempts to isolate and recondition him. But what the Ethereals couldn't understand, what they would never understand, was that Korvash had begun to see the shape of the lie. It wasn't a moment of betrayal. It was a slow, agonizing disillusionment. He watched too many friends fall in campaigns that served no clear purpose. He saw reinforcements withheld for political optics. He received orders from Ethereals that contradicted common sense, costing lives for symbolic posturing. And still, he obeyed, because he believed, until belief gave way to doubt, and doubt gave way to rage. The incident on Daleth did not birth a rebel. It merely unshackled a soul already straining against its chains. After the death of the Ethereal, Korvash could have fled. He could have taken his cadre into hiding, sought refuge with Farsight, or even defected to the Imperium. But he didn't. He stayed. Not out of fear, but defiance. He dared the Tau command to respond. When they didn't, he knew the truth. The Ethereals weren't omniscient. Their reach was not absolute. And if one of them could die, if one could be killed, buried, and forgotten, then perhaps they weren't divine at all. The cadre began calling themselves Ash-Kai behind closed doors. Unbound Flame. A name whispered with reverence and menace. They trained harder than ever before, not in standard formations but in adaptive, brutal tactics. They drilled for asymmetrical warfare, for assassination, for psychological disruption. They began studying their own kind, how to exploit ethereal communication networks, how to mimic caste protocols, how to vanish from sensor arrays without leaving a trace. Corvash became something more than a commander. He became a symbol, not of anarchy, but of war unshackled from hypocrisy. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words struck like plasma fire. We were told the flame was meant to warm the Empire, but we were always the fuel. His warriors followed him not because they had no choice, but because for the first time, they had one. They weren't fighting for the greater good anymore. They were fighting for vengeance, for dignity, for the right to define their own purpose. And it wasn't just his original cadre. Word spread slowly, carefully, through encrypted bursts, through defectors, through old comrades who remembered what it meant to feel pride without manipulation. Disillusioned fire warriors began to seek him out, risking everything to find the Ash Kai. Not out of desperation, but out of hope. Hope that there was still something real beneath the armor. Something worth fighting for that wasn't handed down by cloaked manipulators in floating thrones. Corvash had become the wounded flame, a fire that had been quenched, humiliated, dishonored. And like all fires that survive smothering, it burned hotter. It burned for truth. It burned for blood. There is a moment in every myth where taboo is shattered so violently that reality itself seems to warp. For the Ash Kai, that moment was not the killing of an ethereal. It was what happened after. The act was never planned. The ethereal lay dead, slumped in a pool of blood, his ceremonial robes soaked crimson beneath alien moons. The cadre stood around his body in silence, some shaking, others stunned, all of them blinking through a haze of adrenaline and disbelief. For a long moment, no one moved, and then something ancient surged. Corvash stepped forward. His face was unreadable, his voice low. "This is not over." He knelt, reached into the torn robes, and with deliberate precision tore free a piece of flesh. Some say he looked skyward before placing it into his mouth. Others claim he didn't hesitate. What is known is this: he swallowed it, and in that moment, everything changed. The rest of the cadre followed. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't madness. It was ritual, the spontaneous creation of a new rite born of rebellion and fury. One by one, they partook in what would become known as the devouring. Flesh of the ethereal, consumed not for sustenance, but for dominance, for liberation, to reverse the sacred hierarchy, to tear the divine from their pedestal and make it meat. Symbolically, it was an inversion of everything Tau society held sacred. Practically, it was a declaration of war against the very essence of their species. To the Tau, the Ethereals are not just leaders, they are sacrosanct. Killing one is unthinkable, but to consume one, that is not just heresy, it is annihilation of all ideological foundation. And the Ash Kai did it with a soldier's discipline, not a savage's glee. This was no frenzy. It was a sacrament. Whispers among the Ash Kai began almost immediately, that the act had changed something in them, that they could feel the weight of chains dissolving, that dreams came sharper, more vivid, that the calm induced by ethereal pheromones no longer touched them. Whether true or not, the belief spread like wildfire. They had broken the biological yoke, not just metaphorically, but physically. By consuming the flesh of their masters, they believed they had claimed their essence, their power, and overwritten it with will. Some say this was delusion. Others suspect something darker. After the devouring, the Ash Kai began to evolve. Their tactics became more brutal, more unpredictable. They rejected standard Tau doctrine entirely, instead crafting a martial philosophy rooted in feral discipline and personal clarity. Each warrior was encouraged to find his own meaning within the fire. No longer bound by ritual suppression, they found new instincts awakening, some old, ancestral, others alien. They no longer fought in ranks, but in swarming bursts of autonomous action. like a hive with no queen, a blaze with no hearth. There were further devourings, not many, only when another ethereal fell to their blades. Each one was treated with somber reverence. The body would be displayed. A silent vigil held. And then, pieces were shared among the cadre. Not all participated every time. Some viewed it as sacred, others as a test of courage. But none spoke against it. The act had become central to their myth. They were no longer Tau. They were Ashkai, and to them the flesh of the Ethereals was not a grotesque indulgence. It was an act of war, of reclaiming, of ascension. There are whispers of a time when the Ashkai vanished from every auspex, their life signs masked, their broadcasts silenced. They became ghosts, not in myth, but in method, striking from nowhere, leaving only ash and silence in their wake. Ethereal envoys began to disappear during ceremonial visits. Remote listening posts found their Firecast garrisons butchered, the command cores looted, and the ethereal advisors flayed or burned. No official records remain. But in the shadows of Tau memory, these events are known as the ethereal blackouts. What made the Ashkai truly terrifying wasn't their violence, it was their invisibility. They knew every protocol, every cadence code, every deployment pattern. They were the insiders, the loyal once turned deadly. Their sabotage was surgical, their strikes precise. They understood not just how to kill, but how to erase. They left no witnesses, no survivors, only wreckage that could be blamed on external threats, orcs, rogue Kroot, even Farsight enclaves. The High Ethereal Council knew the truth, but truth had become their enemy. To preserve stability, they had to lie. Every Ashkai strike was folded into official narratives of alien hostility. Entire cadres were declared missing in action rather than admitting they had turned. Ethereals who died were quietly replaced, their names scrubbed. Monitors and handlers were deployed to known Firecast hotspots, watching for any sign of spiritual corrosion. And yet, the Ashkai continued to haunt them, always just out of reach, always 2 steps ahead. Among the Firecast, their legend grew. Some believed they were myth, others hoped they were real. Young warriors in distant war zones whispered of the flameless fire that would come when the Ethereals had gone too far. Veterans who remembered Corvash spoke of him in reverence and fear, as if uttering his name might draw down retribution or salvation. And then came the ash glyphs, charred into walls, etched into plasma burns, carved into ethereal flesh. A single mark, a flame inverted, not rising upward but falling, like a star plunging from the sky. The ash glyph was never explained. It didn't need to be. It was a signature, a statement, a prophecy. Where it appeared, the Tau command structure trembled. It meant the ghosts had passed through. It meant an ethereal had fallen. It meant the greater good had cracked just a little more. The Ashkai were not an army. They were a doctrine of vengeance. Their most terrifying tactic was mimicry. They could pose as loyalists for days, weeks. They could attend briefings, receive orders, fight side by side with true believers until the time came. Then came the sudden shift, the clean, coordinated strike. The Ethereal's throat slit during a strategy session. The stealth drone reprogrammed mid-flight. The entire command web hijacked in seconds. And then, disappearance. How many Ashkai walk among the Firecast even now? How many deployments are infected with their ideology, waiting for the spark to ignite the fuel? The Tau dare not ask, because the answer terrifies them more than any Gwela invasion or Tyrannid swarm. The Ashkai were the mirror the Empire refused to look into, and behind that mirror there were ghosts, and the ghosts were angry. Farsight. The name burns like a brand across the Tau psyche. To some, he is a traitor, a warlord who spat on the greater good and carved his own empire from blood and betrayal. To others, he is a prophet, a liberator, the only one brave enough to speak the truth about the Ethereals. And to the Ashkai, he is something else entirely, Not a hero, not a leader, but a fracture. A possibility. It's tempting to draw parallels between Commander Farsight and the Ashkai. Both turned against the Ethereals. Both rejected the dogma of the greater good. Both formed independent warrior societies forged in fire and autonomy. But that's where the similarity ends. Farsight still believes in structure, in command, in unity, albeit on his terms. He created a new empire with rules, ranks, and ideals. The Ashkai did not. They rejected the very concept of imposed belief. There are fan theories, of course, that Farsight and Corvash met in secret, that the Ashkai were inspired by Farsight's earliest battles, that some of Farsight's own defectors were Ashkai infiltrators, or that Corvash was Farsight's shadow sent to do the things the commander couldn't. But there's no proof, only rumor and the aesthetic similarity of red armor scorched black with ash and flame. What is clear is this: Farsight walks a tightrope. He fights the ethereal regime, but still upholds a vision of order. The Ashkai are chaos with discipline, heresy with purpose. They do not want a new Tau empire. They want no empire at all, only fire. Some within Farsight's enclave speak of the Ashkai with awe, others with disgust. There are whispers that Farsight himself condemned them, privately. That their acts, especially the devourings, crossed a line even he could not justify. That consuming Ethereals was not rebellion, but descent into madness. But even this judgment may mask fear. Because if the Ashkai are right, if the Ethereals are not simply manipulators but parasites, then Farsight, for all his clarity, stopped short of the ultimate truth. And what if Corvash and Farsight never met because they couldn't? Because they represented two incompatible truths? One a general who dreams of a purer empire, the other a warrior who dreams of no empire at all. Farsight builds, Corvash burns. Yet, the echoes persist. The ash glyph has reportedly appeared even on the outskirts of the enclaves. Some enclavists whisper of warriors who fight with inhuman coordination and vanish before questions can be asked. Others believe Corvash might still be alive, ageless, mutated, transformed by the devourings into something more than Tau. Perhaps the Ashkai linger in Farsight's wake, testing him, waiting for him to admit what he already knows but cannot say. In a way, the Ashkai are Farsight's shadow, the dark path he refused to take, the reminder that liberation without truth is just a new mask, and perhaps that is why the Ethereals fear them more than they fear him, because Farsight challenges the throne. The Ashkai set fire to the whole damn palace. It happened on the outer fringes of Viorlo Sept, in a garrison where discipline had eroded into routine and vigilance had softened into complacency. The fire caste stationed there were worn, having cycled through 7 consecutive deployments without rest, their minds frayed, their bodies tight with exhaustion, and their faith in the Ethereals flickering like a dying glow lamp. It was there that the Ashkai struck, not with stealth, but with spectacle. The facility was known as Strongpoint Enkar, and it served as a training and indoctrination center for newly blooded fire warriors. An ethereal named Anshir oversaw operations, his voice known for its cold confidence, his gaze said to still a charging Kroot. For cycles he'd kept the warriors docile, their unrest smothered beneath lectures, rituals, and chemical pacification. But the fire had already kindled, and when the Ashkai arrived, they brought an inferno. It began at midnight, under a crimson eclipse. The outer sentries were found incinerated in their armor, not by enemy fire, but by internal system overrides. Plasma rifles detonated from within. An eerie silence fell. The base's power grid crashed. Emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows. And then the ash glyph appeared, projected on every wall, burning with an unnatural luminance, seared directly into the command terminals. They did not enter like saboteurs. They entered like gods of vengeance. Corvash led them personally, according to a Guevesa technician who fled into the jungle and lived only long enough to scrawl a message in his own blood. The Ashkai moved as one, silent, unyielding, and unerringly lethal. They did not target the garrison's infrastructure or supply lines. They walked directly into the ceremonial chamber where Anshir prepared his morning address, and they made an altar of his body. What followed was not a battle. It was a ritual. The Fire Caste soldiers stationed there didn't resist. Some dropped their weapons in awe. Others joined the Ashkai on the spot. The indoctrination center became a temple of reversal. Anshir's remains were hung from the central plinth where he once preached. His blood was mixed with incense and used to mark the walls. And then came the feast. Eyewitnesses described it in fragmented horror. Black-armored figures kneeling in reverent silence. Flesh passed hand to hand, consumed with solemn purpose. No frenzy, no laughter, only ritual, only fire. This was not just rebellion. It was revolution, etched in gore and flame. When Tau High Command finally responded, they found only ruin. The Ashkai were gone, but the entire garrison had vanished with them. Not dead, gone, converted, taken into the fold of the unbound. Their former identities purged, their names erased. Only the ash glyph remained, etched into scorched stone, untouched by the cleanup teams no matter how hard they scrubbed. The event was never reported. The official logs speak of a viral plague, a containment breach, an unspecified bioweapon. But across the Tau net, encrypted messages passed from Fire Caste warrior to warrior, telling of the night the fire came. Of the moment belief was torn apart, and something older, darker, and purer took its place. They call it the Feast of Viorlos. And for those who know, it marks the point where rebellion became religion. The Tau Empire prides itself on order, on clarity, hierarchy, and control. But when that order is threatened from within, when the very foundations are shaken by insurrection so profound it defies categorization, the response is swift, brutal, and unrelenting. The Ashkai were not just rebels, they were an existential threat, and the Ethereal caste moved to erase them with clinical precision. It began with silence. The first official reaction to the Ashkai was a blanket of denial. No reports were filed, no investigations launched. Communications were interrupted, operations delayed. Commanders who spoke of the ash glyph were reassigned or disappeared entirely. The Ethereals knew that acknowledging the Ashkai publicly would unravel the illusion of perfect loyalty. So instead, they buried it. Then came the re-indoctrination waves. Entire cadres were recalled under the guise of rotation or doctrinal enrichment. Those showing signs of independent thought or inconsistent responses during ritual affirmations were separated. Some never returned. Others emerged pale and broken, with wide eyes and hollow voices. Re-indoctrination was not just physical. It was chemical, psychological, spiritual. The Ethereals began deploying a new kind of envoy, shadow priests whose role was not to inspire, but to interrogate. To break the mind and reforge it in silent rooms where screams never reached the surface. The Empire developed new algorithms to track behavioral deviance. Drones monitored biometric signatures not just in battle, but in rest. Sleep cycles, speech patterns, even blink rates were measured against baseline profiles. The Fire Caste barracks were flooded with propaganda at all hours. Repetitive affirmations, soothing mantras, artificially infused with calming pheromones. It wasn't about belief anymore. It was about saturation. But repression bred resistance. Cadres suspected of Ashkai sympathies were reassigned to suicidal fronts. On one planet, a fire warrior squad was deployed without support against a tyrannid vanguard. Not one survived. Their transponder logs were erased the next day. On another world, a Guevesa unit loyal to Corvash was executed by pulse fire during a training accident. The message was clear. Loyalty is monitored, but heresy is hunted. There were purges within the ethereal caste as well. Those whose oversight allowed Ashkai influence to spread were demoted or exiled. Rumors spoke of a secret tribunal, led by Anva's inner circle, tasked with auditing the failures of the caste. A crisis of faith hidden behind ceremonial curtains. Even the leaders of control began to fear the wildfire they had ignited. New technologies were rushed into service: mind-scanning helmets, loyalty verification drones, emotionally reactive armor. The goal was not just to detect rebellion, but to prevent thought itself. The Tau dream of unity turned darker, more totalitarian, more desperate. And still, the Ashkai persisted. They adapted. They grew more subtle, more patient. They learned to play the game, to pass the tests, to exist as sleepers until the moment came. Some even endured re-indoctrination, emerged seemingly corrected, only to later orchestrate spectacular acts of sabotage. The Ethereals were trying to fight an idea with tools designed for obedience. It wasn't working. The Empire's response to the Ashkai was not just militarized. It became theological. New oaths were written, new liturgies sung. The sacredness of the ethereal body was emphasized in sermons with terrifying fervor. To even speak of bodily harm toward an ethereal became a blasphemy punishable by death. But none of it mattered, because once the fire of rebellion is lit, you cannot drown it in words. You must either become fire yourself or be consumed. There is no monument to the Ashkai, no shrine, no verse, no name carved into Tau marble. The Empire would have you believe they never existed, that they were myths, ghosts, lies whispered by the fearful. But truth is not bound by archives. It lives in the scars of the fire caste, in the haunted silences between battle cries, and in the fire that refuses to die. Korvash is gone, or perhaps he's become something else entirely. Some say he still leads the Ashkai from the shadows, his flesh changed by the devourings, his mind a furnace of clarity that burns too bright for others to endure. Others believe he was consumed by his own myth, devoured not by bullets, but by the purity of his purpose. But whether he breathes or not doesn't matter. He is legend now, and legends are immortal. The Ashkai movement remains unclaimed. It is leaderless, formless, yet alive. A doctrine of fire passed from warrior to warrior in stolen moments and encrypted whispers. It has no symbols but the glyph, no creed but defiance. It teaches that obedience is not virtue, that hierarchy is not destiny, and that freedom must sometimes be won with the teeth. Among the fire caste, their legacy is felt in ways the Ethereals cannot measure. In the way young warriors hesitate before a ritual affirmation, in the cold glares cast at handlers who arrive smelling of control, in the sharpening of blades not for war, but for choice. It is a quiet rebellion, a simmer beneath the surface, a knowing that they are more than tools, that they were meant for more than obedience, that the fire inside them is not a leash, but a weapon. And still, the ash glyph appears, not just on battlefields now, but on transport hulls, on the edges of data slates, in the margins of war journals. It is drawn by those who remember, who believe, who wait. The Tau erase it, again and again, but always it returns. Because you cannot kill an idea born of betrayal and forged in blood. The Ethereals are adapting, yes. They evolve their control, sharpen their doctrines, perfect their lies. But even they must feel it now, that tremble in the soil beneath their citadels, that whisper at the edge of every broadcast. The knowledge that there are those among the fire caste who do not kneel, who do not forget, who are waiting. And when the time comes, they will rise, not for empire, not for conquest, but to burn away the rot and breathe smoke into the stars. They are not Tau anymore. They are not bound by caste or creed. They are fire. They are Ashkai. There is something profoundly terrifying about silence, not the absence of sound, but the intentional manufactured void that follows forbidden truth. In the aftermath of the Feast of Viorlos, that silence became weaponized. The Empire didn't just deny the Ash-Kai's existence, it began to erase memory itself. Data was purged, names deleted from databases, entire deployments retroactively rewritten. What remained wasn't history, but an engineered forgetting. And within that cold void, something new began to grow: the silent culture of fire. The surviving witnesses to Ash-Kai actions, whether they were civilians, auxiliary allies, or broken fire warriors too traumatized to resist, were not killed outright. Many were taken, vanished, sent to deep indoctrination facilities on far-off moons or sterile orbital stations where the stars never moved. There, they were subjected to psychological fragmentation protocols, a euphemism for a process so invasive and dehumanizing it tore identity from bone. Some returned to service, vacant-eyed, repeating ethereal mantras with ghost-like precision. Others didn't return at all. But memory, even when shattered, leaves shadows. Among the lower castes, especially the Guevesa, rumors began to flourish. Whispers of entire cadres that had gone gray, of fire warriors who no longer saluted but simply stared, unblinking as Ethereals passed. They called them ash-burnt in crude low Gothic, those who had seen too much and survived. And from their half-coherent mutterings and scribbled glyphs, a forbidden folklore began to bloom. These stories weren't grand tales of revolution. They were fragments, a drone's eye that refused to turn off, a communication burst that played the same inverted flame symbol on loop, a training instructor who flinched when hearing the phrase, "for the greater good." The fear wasn't just that the Ash-Kai might strike again, but that they had never truly left. The Empire responded by deepening its surveillance, embedding loyalty officers within even the most routine operations. They weren't there to command, only to watch, to record, to measure tremors of dissent like seismic disturbances. Firecast officers found their reports flagged for using words like doubt, choice, or worst of all, why. Even mild deviations from language templates used in mission briefings could result in reassignment or termination. But the more the Ethereals clamped down, the more pressure they generated. And under that pressure, a strange metamorphosis began to take place. Not rebellion, not overtly, but cultural mutation. Among some fire warriors, a new ritual emerged, the burning vigil. After a battle, they would sit in silence around the dead, backs to the bodies, weapons sheathed, in complete stillness. No words, no honors, no affirmations of the greater good, just fire. They would light small braziers and stare into them until the flames died. The Ethereals outlawed the practice the moment they discovered it, which only made it spread further. Within those flickering embers, the Ash-Kai lived on. You see, rebellion isn't just violence. It's language, it's gesture, it's memory. And for the Ash-Kai, memory was the battlefield they had chosen next. Not one of weapons, but of meaning. Their war wasn't just fought in blood, it was fought in how the Fire Caste remembered itself. Not as tools, not as symbols, but as people. As beings who once held pride, pain, loyalty, fury, and the right to choose where to place it. Some Tao philosophers, those brave enough to speak in private, began to argue that the Ash-Kai represented an evolutionary fracture, that perhaps the Fire Caste had been constrained too long, that perhaps the biological urge to serve had begun to atrophy, that what the Ash-Kai showed was not savagery, but awakening, not a fall, but a metamorphosis, a caste outgrowing its leash. The Ethereals answered with purges. Entire philosophy cohorts were dissolved overnight, their works erased. But the ideas remained, written in code, passed on quantum relays buried in sub-audio waves, etched into the hulls of dropships in patterns no machine would ever flag. And when the ash glyph appeared again, not on a battlefield, but in the meditative temple of a training dome on Sachia, It sent a tremor through the High Council. It meant the Ashkai were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were watching, waiting, and perhaps guiding, because the Ashkai no longer needed to win with blades alone. Their war had moved into the hearts of the young, the doubtful, the angry. And for every fire warrior who dared to skip a ritual, to question a briefing, to hold that burning vigil in silence, the fire spread. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but it was kindling. And the Empire, no matter how many sermons it broadcast, could not unburn what had already caught flame. There is a silence deeper than censorship, a silence that lives not in absence, but in reverence. And among the disillusioned elements of the fire caste, that silence began to take on a name: the Deep Ember. It was not a movement, not even a doctrine, merely a recognition. A term for that sensation, shared across hundreds of warriors, that something had cracked beneath the polished surface of their lives and would never truly mend. The Deep Ember was not spoken of openly. It didn't need to be. It existed in the held gaze between fire warriors who'd lost entire squads and received only ceremonial platitudes. It lived in the moments where pulse rifles were cleaned not with pride, but with detachment, where war was no longer holy, but endless, where loyalty felt more like inertia than belief. This quiet despair was not a breakdown. It was the beginning of awakening. For many, the Ashkai were not a goal. They were a mirror, a terrible, exhilarating glimpse into what might happen if you let go of the leash entirely, if you gave up not just obedience, but identity. And that mirror haunted them. It asked questions the Empire couldn't tolerate. Who am I without the caste? Who do I serve when the Ethereals fall silent? What is my fire burn for, if not their cause? These questions birthed a strange and silent priesthood, not one of rituals or relics, but of memory and watching. Warriors who'd encountered Ashkai events and lived. They carried the weight of it, not as converts, not as agents, but as witnesses. They never drew the ash glyph. They never whispered the forbidden names. But in their silence, they remembered. And memory is a seed. The ethereal caste understood this too late. They focused their countermeasures on insurgency, sabotage, betrayal. They missed the slow seepage of meaning. They never realized that what the Ashkai had truly done was not to kill Ethereals, but to kill certainty. They introduced ambiguity into a world that had no place for it. And ambiguity is like rust. It doesn't shout, it just spreads. Soon, officers began to report strange behavior. Cadres completing missions flawlessly, yet refusing to participate in celebration rituals. Fire warriors questioning kill orders not for mercy, but for meaning. Entire platoons choosing to sleep outside the designated temple zones, citing field fatigue, when in truth they simply refused to be near the scent of an ethereal. These were not traitors. These were Tau doing exactly what they were bred never to do, choosing. And the choosing was spreading. In the educational hubs of Town and Borken, certain intellectuals began embedding Ashkai motifs into artwork, disguised as classical abstractions. Historians began privately cataloging unexplained disappearances of ethereals and attributing them not to foreign enemies, but to internal stress fractures. And a new field of study emerged, socio-mimetic insurgency theory. It focused not on weapons, but on the spread of forbidden thought. These academics vanished, one by one. But their work was saved, passed on, digitized, hidden. By now, the Ashkai had become more than a movement. They were a virus in the code of the Tau soul, not a virus of destruction, but of possibility. They offered no blueprint. They made no demands. They only proved one thing. The caste could be broken. The leash could be severed. And once severed, the warrior did not collapse. He rose. Among the older generations, this truth was unbearable. But for the young, it was fuel. They began to dream differently. Their battle hymns no longer stirred them. Their hearts responded not to ceremony, but to raw instinct, to the call of a freedom they had never known, but now could no longer forget. And in that void, the ash glyph returned, not as a mark of fear, but as a beacon. In one shocking incident, a training cadre on Daleth completed its final simulation, and instead of returning to the barracks, they all removed their helmets, painted inverted flames across their armor, and sat in silence around a brazier made of shattered drone parts. They did not attack. They did not flee. When confronted, they simply said, "We are not weapons. We are fire." The incident was contained, the footage erased, but those words echoed. And in the most secret chambers of the high ethereal conclaves, where the Ancient Ones still consult forgotten doctrines and biologically encoded memory cores, there is now a whisper, a fear that cannot be eradicated, that the Ash Kai were not an aberration, but a mutation, that the fire caste was never meant to be chained forever, that eventually fire learns to burn the hand that lit it, and when that happens, not in revolt, not in riot, but in awakening, there will be no army to suppress it, no doctrine to control it, no ethereal left to pacify it. There will only be flame. In the upper echelons of the ethereal caste, where robes are woven from threads spun in 0G and words carry the weight of law, there is a secret horror, never spoken, never written. The horror is not rebellion, not even death. It is doubt. Because when the Ethereals lose belief in themselves, their entire empire begins to rot from the head down. And that rot had begun. Antiash was among the first, a revered counselor and ritual harmonizer assigned to oversee the indoctrination cycles of 3 major fire caste academies. He had performed over 400 ritual confirmations, overseen dozens of warrior path refinements, and written 8 volumes on loyalty sequencing. And then, one cycle, he simply stopped speaking. Not publicly, not immediately. But in private sessions with junior Ethereals, he would pause mid-sentence, hesitate, and say things like, "Is our guidance still enough?" Or, "What if they've learned to feel in ways we no longer can?" At first, his peers laughed. Then they warned him. Then they isolated him. Antiash was reassigned quietly to a distant orbital station above a dead world where no fire caste presence existed. 2 cycles later, his body was found, stripped of his robes, surrounded by ash. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Only one thing remained on the bulkhead, written in his own blood. "They dream without us now." He was not the last. Among the Ethereals, the very concept of fracture is anathema. They are raised not only to command, but to believe in their role as the stabilizing force of Tau civilization. They are told from infancy that they possess a unique essence, a biological and spiritual clarity no other caste can manifest. But as the Ash Kai's legend spreads, even when unspoken, it becomes a poison in the communal mind. If the fire caste no longer needs control, then what is an ethereal but a useless relic? Some Ethereals responded with fanaticism. Ondegor, a high-ranking operative in the Viorlos Sept, began performing live purifications, publicly executing warriors suspected of Ash Kai sympathies without trial. His speeches turned desperate, filled with invocations not to unity, but to obedience. His final broadcast ended with him screaming, "You are fire, but we are the air! Without us, you choke!" before detonating his own command chamber in a scorched self-immolation. Others tried a different path. Onnai, a moderate voice within the ruling council of Falshia, proposed radical transparency, allowing warriors limited self-determination in matters of tactics, honor rituals, and even spiritual observance. He argued that the Ash Kai represented a misstep, not a mutation, that the flame could be redirected, not extinguished. His words were met with silence, then censure, then exile. And in the echoing silence of his departure, other voices rose, lower-ranked Ethereals, once content to bask in second-hand authority, now quietly questioning their role. If power had to be enforced through fear, then was it still power? If loyalty had to be chemically induced, was it still faith? These questions were not asked aloud, but they were felt deeply, and they wormed their way into dreams. Because Ethereals dream too. And increasingly, those dreams turned to fire. Reports began surfacing of Ethereals experiencing psychological break events, moments of inexplicable terror when standing near fire warriors. Hallucinations of being stared at not with awe, but hunger. Phantom echoes of the ash glyph on walls where none existed. Auditory delusions of chanting in voices not heard in any ritual record. The medical diagnosis was simple: trauma response syndrome. The deeper truth was far worse. They were afraid, not just of the Ash Kai as an enemy, but of what they meant, of what they revealed, that the myth of perfect unity was only ever a story, that the caste system was a dam, not a foundation, that the fire caste was evolving and the Ethereals had been left behind, preachers of a creed that no longer resonated with the soul it once pacified. And perhaps, on some level, they understood the deepest horror of all, that the Ash Kai did not want to rule, that they offered no replacement doctrine, no new hierarchy, no plan for succession, because fire doesn't replace. It consumes. His name was Shazla Tarun, born of the industrial hives of Dianoi, hardened by endless drills and the sound of screaming plasma drills outside his childhood hab. He had never seen an Ethereal in person, only their avatars, holograms in the barracks, flickering sermons played before rations were dispensed, scent projectors misting calming pheromones into mess halls. To him, loyalty was ambient. The greater good was simply the air he breathed, until he heard the story. It came on the second week of his off-world deployment, a routine resupply escort paired with a veteran team from Viorlos, the kind of quiet patrol where the silence between missions grows longer than the debriefs. That was when Shasui Valrek began to speak, not formally, not with ceremony, but low, quiet, at the edge of the perimeter beacon. He told Tarun about Strongpoint and Kar. He told him about the eclipse, the plasma detonations, the ash glyph that burned itself onto every screen like a scar. He described the figures in blackened armor, the ritual stillness, the silence deeper than death. He said he had not fired when they came. None of them had. He had simply watched and understood that something had changed forever. Tarun didn't believe him. At first. But that night, in his bunk, the glyph came back. Not on a screen, not in real life, in his dream. He saw it scorched into the skin of a dead Ethereal, still twitching. And the dream was not a nightmare. It was peace. Over the following weeks, Tarun began noticing changes in himself. He grew distant during morning affirmations. The mantras rang hollow in his ears. His trigger discipline sharpened, but not out of training, out of clarity. He stopped eating when the scent filters activated. He covered his nose and claimed nausea. Inside, he knew it wasn't sickness. It was rejection. The perfume of control had soured. He began to notice other warriors acting strangely too. A pause before saluting an Ethereal officer. A hesitation before repeating the words, "We serve." And once he saw it, drawn in dirt on the underside of a ruined Piranha chassis, the inverted flame. Small, perfect, and left unwashed. There was no indoctrination, no pamphlet, no secret code passed in shadows, only resonance, like the song of a flame finding more tinder. Eventually, Tarun was rotated back to the academy. He kept his silence, but the silence was not compliance. It was study. He began reading old fragments recovered from human texts, manuals of resistance, treatises on free will. He found echoes of the Ash Kai even there, not in the words, but in the hunger, the refusal, the burn. One day, He entered the temple chamber as all recruits did. A new Ethereal had arrived, young, pristine, his robes unwrinkled, his words soft like lullabies. The ceremony began. Each initiate was to kneel and affirm the bond. One by one they did. Tarun watched, waited, and when his turn came, he stood still. He looked at the Ethereal, met his eyes, and said nothing. The chamber fell into breathless hush. The Ethereal spoke softly. "Do you not swear loyalty to the greater good?" Tarun answered, not with rebellion, not with aggression, but with the quiet words that had lived inside him since that first story was told. "I swear to burn, not kneel." What happened next is not recorded. The logs of that day are sealed. The Ethereal was reassigned, rumored to have suffered from a phenomenal breakdown. Tarun was never seen in open formation again, but his name appeared in another context, encoded into the footnote of a damaged transmission intercepted from a Kroot outpost months later. Shasvra Tarun, missing in action, presumed dead, except someone, something, had signed the message with a glyph, a flame, inverted, and below it, a phrase not spoken in any Tau dialect. "We awaken in silence, and we speak in fire." Among the new recruits, his name became a whisper. Among the Gwevesa, it became a chant. And among the Ashkai, if they truly live still, it became a new kindling. Because this is how fire spreads, not with orders, with stories. If this saga lit a spark in you, if these forgotten flames stirred your sense of rebellion and wonder, then stand with us. Subscribe. Join the cause. We are many. We are unbound. And we remember.